We're here with Greg Gilman from Mute6. Thanks for joining us, Greg.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
How did you get into this business in the first place? What's your origin story before we even talk about Mute6?
Yeah, so I've been in the performance marketing lead gen space for about 15 years now. Steve Weiss, who's the CEO of the company, a good friend of mine, moved me out to LA, was like, hey, started this agency. We're really onto something here. And at the time when I joined, we were about 20 people. And at this point, we're at about 215.
Wow. Okay. So growing fast. When you say we, Mute6, what is it? What's the pain point that you started to address that clearly led to this exponential growth?
Yeah. So when Steve started the agency, and even as I joined, what we found is there's a big hole in the market for performance marketing. So you had large agencies that were kind of focusing on top of funnel brand campaigns. But as you had the growth of the e-commerce companies kind of start about 7-8 years ago, like the digitally native direct-to-consumer e-com companies, there was no one servicing the market that was really focused on performance marketing. And when I say performance marketing, I mean owning the entire funnel from ad to back-end CRM. So we found a good opportunity there where what we found for brands was most important was to bring value. And then since then, we found a big hole in the market on the creative front. One of the main needs of the companies that we work with is content being kind of key. So we have a 65-person in-house video creative team that specializes in building what we call data-driven direct response content. So content that is reverse engineered to sell product rather than just lifestyle content that's put out to look good.
So I just want to break that down a little bit. Performance marketing, right? Everybody feels like their marketing should be performing, but you're saying performance marketing is saying, hey, we're not just throwing it out there. We're doing it from an analytics perspective, and then we're actually being accountable for the traction that you provide.
So when we talk about performance marketing, it's key to think about every part of the funnel. So not just the ad. So if I'm a Facebook ad agency and I'm like, all I'm worried about is the Facebook ads, and then on the back end, what I'm missing is everything from point of prospecting all the way through as I bring them through my CRM. Because at the end of the day, it's important to think about how do I drive as much first-party data into my CRM as possible.
Okay, tell me what's first-party data?
Okay, so when we talk about what is the value add and what are D2C brands doing differently than traditional brands out there. So before D2C, right, the only place that you could buy product in-store, online on marketplaces. But with the rise of the D2C companies, what they are doing and the reason that they get these high valuations because they own the consumer, right? Look at COVID right now. So what's happening right now in the brick and mortar retail space is a lot of advertisers are frantic because stores are shut and they have no idea who their consumer is. So the D2C brands that are skyrocketing at this point, and when we talk about accountability and first-party data, the ones that are successful use platforms like Facebook and Google to fish for people to drive them into their CRM, and ultimately they own that consumer. I know exactly who's clicking on my ads. I know exactly who's purchasing on my product. If you look at retail brands and like fashion and apparel brands that sell at the mall, if you ask them who's purchasing your product, they don't know. But there's a revenue stream, so it's okay. But once that revenue stream is taken away with things like COVID, you start to look around and be like, well, what's everyone else doing? So that's when I say being accountability for the full funnel, making sure that people make it to the end result, which is either going to be purchase or into the CRM so I can continue to work that lead into a purchase.
I think it's really interesting, especially when we're talking about companies that traditionally are doing distribution overseas and globally. They're just happy to have a sale. They're happy that somebody's paying somewhat upfront, some portion of their purchasing upfront. But actually, when you're talking about it, they don't fully understand the value of having that direct communication with the consumer and owning the entire vertical with that consumer.
Okay, so my number one advice to anyone who's either starting a business or thinking about starting a business is most importantly to own the consumer. So that means make sure that when you're out marketing your product, make sure that all of your email and automations are set up, but make sure your focus as a business is not just thinking about how do I drive revenue in, right? Because a lot of D2C brands that we work with will start D2C. My recommendation is only work on driving people to your .com versus just going the Amazon route or the wholesale route. So what I see a lot of brands doing now, at least with the brands that we work with, is starting just doing their own marketing to their .com. And as they get larger, they start to branch out into wholesale opportunities where they can test new products. But once you go that route, I would never tell a business to start the wholesale route at this point, because you're doing yourself a disservice. When you try and drive people into your own store, you're going to run into issues if you want to do different pricing and launch different products. So the model has completely shifted in terms of what we're seeing with the D2C businesses.
That's extremely valuable for a lot of the companies that we talk to, because they really are addicted to those distributor relationships, a lot of the legacy situations they've got coming in. But what you're saying, obviously, is continue to own, and you need to start owning that D2C if you're willing to pull the Band-Aid off and say no possibly to some of those attractive upfront deals, right?
100%. It's even when we talk about things like Amazon, right? People get so hooked on it. So let me walk you through a couple situations, because we've been through this. If I'm a new brand and I go and I launch a product just on my site, I know that any marketing that I'm doing ultimately will come in and come to my .com. So now let's say I go and I put my brand on Amazon, right? A couple of things will happen that are not in your control, and not to say that you have a good or bad product, but let's say you get a couple negative reviews. Let's say your competitors see that you're launching a competitive product and decide to troll you with some 1-star reviews. So let's think about the buyer process. We use Facebook for prospecting and we use it for discovery. So I see a really cool product on Facebook. What are the first 2 things that I usually do? 1, I go to Google to see if it's legit. And 2, I go to Prime to see if I can buy it, because then I don't have to give anyone else my info. And it's 1 click, buy now, I'm in the cart. But where we've seen issues before with Amazon, when you launch products, sometimes either too early, or if your product, let's say you still have to work some of the kinks out of your product, the trolls will come out and give you bad reviews. So now I see a product on Facebook, I go to Google and check. Let's say I go to Amazon and you have 10 5-star reviews and 4 1-star reviews. Chances are the person is not going to buy that product. And you can't remove those reviews. The only way to get around that is to launch your company under a new name, which is a pain. So my recommendation to new brands is always focus on the .com, drive as much traffic as you can in there, and then later on you can use Amazon to drive additional value in. But again, there's lost attribution and tracking between the 2 platforms. We're working on ways around that. There's betas that you can do so. But if you think about the logical explanation that I rolled out, it's definitely better to try and focus on driving as many people into your CRM with as less holes coming through as possible.
That's great. And in some ways, you can do that even setting up an Insta page, for example, to capture those emails. You can do this around the world with language localized, I guess, landing pages without having to do a whole big reboot of your site in multiple languages, correct?
Correct. So the landing page is actually a good example to capture that data. There's definitely growth hacky ways to do it. But again, like what we want to do is, even if you're capturing the data, but you're using Facebook to drive the majority of the prospecting, the pixel still kind of falls off a little bit there. So at the end of the day, Amazon is definitely a good place for revenue generation. It's getting bigger. You can build around your Amazon store, but as it pertains to some of the D2C businesses and our philosophy and approach of creative first, driving it through to the D2C store and driving it into your CRM, there's definitely a couple of things there that I think still need to be improved.
Okay, great. Let's talk global. Top platforms you should be thinking about for different markets.
Yeah, so we focus the majority of our product. Facebook is where we do the majority of our spend. Google as well, and we use Google for new customer acquisition, so things like display shopping and YouTube. We have played around with a lot of things, and we have a team here that does connected. So programmatic will be display, native connected TV, and Amazon DSP have great data there. And then even as we venture farther, we're getting into things like Snapchat and TikTok, and we'll use more exploratory channels where our content lends itself well, but it's less expensive than some of the traditional channels. But for D2C brands, this is where you're going to be spending the bulk of your money.
Okay, let's talk about some of the opportunities in different markets. The competition for keywords and for spend is less in emerging markets, my understanding is. Could you talk a little bit about that opportunity?
Yeah, so there's definitely in global markets, I think it's figuring out which products are best where, right? The US is obviously one of the best markets out there because we're a consumer focused market. People just they buy over their means, and they're always consuming. So when we look to places like other countries and where we can buy cheaper traffic, I think we get into the larger conversation of, well, let's talk about the business behind that, right? Let's talk about things like logistics. Let's talk about how we get out there and we message, and like think about how, if we are going to take things cross border, what that looks like. Will it be at a detriment to my brand? Like, is shipping going to be an issue, and like things like that. So as long as companies are prepared to execute and they have a good idea about the brand messaging, which again is key, then I think it's fine. I think where companies can, sometimes they think globally, but really should be executing on a local basis is like, they're like, oh yeah, like it should be easy, right? I just, throw extra postage on and boom, like they don't think about logistics or local duties and taxes. And like, what if it goes sideways, right? Like, let's say, can you rely on these platforms? Do you have someone in that country who can help? Do you have a 3PL? Like things like that are super important to think about as well.
Sure, and hopefully all those people watching are following all of our other badges and modules that do talk about optimizing that. So let's assume that they've got that covered, which I know is a big assumption. Now it's the time to build that brand. Are you saying that, for example, if I'm in Latin America, I'll get better bang for my buck by advertising there on a Google or a Facebook than I would perhaps in the US? And maybe you could talk a little bit about that process, to some degree.
Yeah, so there's definitely, so sometimes you will get more bang for the buck, but the question is reach usually, right? Like the reach in the US is just so big. So yes, you'll get more bang for your buck, but at some point I've worked with products, and this is even in a previous life and in other countries, and like it just comes down to scale, right? I think it depends on what is your core focus as a business, because some businesses say, look, we're not looking to sell to everyone. We want to focus more on like the one-to-one relationship, and we're trying to be super exclusive, so it really doesn't matter. And then we work with brands that are like, we don't care. We want to sell as much product at as low of a cost as possible. So overseas, I think you have to think about when you're taking a product, and it suits well for us because we work on products that are products that solve needs, products that have strong user value props, because that's demonstratable. We can build content, we can show that in other countries where it doesn't involve a ton of localization, because we're focused on building products that like it should just click and make sense. If you're a fashion and apparel brand, and I'll give you two working examples. So we've reached out to and chatted with a lot of European fashion companies, right? Both by default, because about a third of our business is within the fashion and apparel space. But here in the States, we work with companies that have, key differentiators like the types of material that are built into the fabrics, user value props. So like maybe a zipper in the shirt, or like a stretchy material, or like it doesn't sweat so much. So like these are things that make it different, right? These type of products are very easy to make content for. It's very easy, like visually, for me to understand. It doesn't matter what language it's in because I can translate the text on the screen. So it's easy for me to take that product from the US and sell it in another country as long as I have the logistics and the fulfillment handled. When I talk with European fashion companies, or companies that are built on the traditional model of runway fashion, it's very like chic, they're in high-end magazines, and then they want to take that to a mass audience, it's very tough because the consumer who's buying that has to go through the process of like seeing it in the magazine, talking about it with their friends. Now I'm in the store, I'm being sold by someone who's telling me how it's so important and hyped up. So products like that lose a little bit of like what makes them special in this like D2C world, right? Selling a $2,000, $3,000 jacket because this runway model wore it, down the runway at the whatever it is, New York Fashion Week, is very different than even a $300 or $400 jacket that serves a purpose, that has cool value props, with I saw it first on Facebook, I was retargeted on Instagram, and then I walked through the flow. I've been retargeted through email about the cool value prop. So it's a different type of experience. So companies that want to go cross-border should focus on their product and make sure that their product solves a need. If it doesn't, then you will have to focus much more on localization towards your messaging, and actually might have to take a little bit of a different approach than what we do, rather than a more product problem solution approach, which makes it easier for us to go cross-border.
Greg, that's very helpful. Let's needle into that a little bit more for those watching at home. You're talking about identifying and crystallizing that value proposition in a way that can be articulated in a few seconds and without necessarily even language, or if it is language, it's minimal language that you can then translate, correct?
Correct. So the traditional user, Facebook and Instagram, scrolls through about 300 feet of news feed a day. So the question that I ask brands is, what's stopping the thumb, right? So we actually have a metric that we built and we will optimize for, which is called the thumb stop rate. So this is 3-second video views. So what that means is that when I'm creating content to try and get people to drive them down the funnel into my product, you have 3 seconds to capture someone's attention. Think about it next time you're scrolling through Instagram and you actually stop on an ad or something that catches your eye. Scroll, 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 look, 3 seconds. I'm either interested or I'm not. So we will optimize around that. And what we try and do, and if you want to use a rough benchmark of whether your ads are up to par or not, 30%, meaning that 30% of the people make it past the first 3 seconds. If they're not, you need to rethink the angle or the hook that you have on the front end of your video creative.
That's great. And for the companies that are looking to really kind of build more efficiencies and they have maybe tighter budgets, again, when you're creating that content in the US, think about it as how easy is this to translate both culturally, both attributes and value prop, but also linguistically and translation for another market.
Correct. Yeah. And I think that that's where it boils down to our core philosophy. And what we look for in a partner is, can you, in 5 bullet points, tell me why we should work with your product, right? It's a question I ask entrepreneurs on every phone call. I'm like, tell me what makes your product different, right? Because if they have a tough time rattling off 4 or 5 main reasons why their product is different, we're going to have a very tough time selling that product. So focus on the product, focus on what makes it different, and then we do the rest.
Let's talk about identifying your audience. There's a lot of discussion around, today's world, can I go broad in terms of geography, but very deep in terms of my audience, versus saying, hey, let me go into San Francisco, New York, LA, let me really do that because geographically I think it's easier. But I feel like that's an antiquated perspective, because you may identify, I only deal with left-handed people who limp and have white hair, right? Like, is that, basically I guess the question is, do you think that it's more important to identify your tribe without any geographical barriers, assuming you've already optimized for delivery, or go deep on a geographical perspective?
I think the question is, does it matter, right? So we have brands that come in and they're like, we only want to sell, to your point, the left-handed, right-handed. If someone says, I only want to sell to left-handed people, well, then we have to target only left-handed people. Usually what we will do, at least, I'll just talk about in the States, is when we launch a campaign, focus on building it by creative angle. So back to my original point of, what are the 4 main reasons that make your product different? That means there's probably 4 different types of people who would buy your product. So let's build content or an initial hook around each one of those 4 and actually target into more of a nationwide campaign. If you're like, Greg, my product's more expensive and I want to focus on higher income people, then we'll lay geography over as a proxy for income, right? If it's more around like gender or age, again, we can target some of the messaging, but what we will try and do is focus on purchasing habits. So on things like Facebook, you can layer on interest targeting, and on Google, you can layer on things around even past behavior. So you have audiences that are custom intent and custom affinity. So custom affinity is like Facebook's lookalike kind of audience structuring, and custom intent is going to be based off of actual search data that Google, every time you punch something into Google, they're pulling a data profile on you. So if I'm searching for best black iPhone cases, And now that I'm on YouTube and I'm watching a video and I see an ad for black iPhone cases, like, it's not a coincidence, right? They're pulling that data. So when I think about targeting and going into larger pools, Mute 6's philosophy is build better content on the front end to drive into this larger ecosystem, rather than me saying, let me focus on specific areas. Because if the name of the game is how do I drive the lowest cost per acquisition, it shouldn't matter where they're coming from, unless it's something that's like a localized event and I'm driving people into a specific store.
Okay, so if you segment properly and you're able to deliver globally, you can be global on day one.
Correct.
Real quick, so you talk about over-segmenting. Could you talk about that a little bit?
So some people try and outsmart or think that, hey, we work with a lot of really smart people, and typically they'll come in and say, Greg, we know our target audience, we know who buys our product, we know our woman, we know our man, and we're like, great, perfect, right? It makes it a lot easier when we're outlining where we're gonna start. But as we grow, one thing that has been really interesting to see is when you find people who were not in what you think your general kind of profile of personal buyer, right? Like when you start to target, like around gifting season, I'll use an example, and holiday messaging and Valentine's Day, like targeting for gifting ideas for his or her, or getting into like different uses for the same product. Or like one thing that I think is important is like when you read the comments of your ads, very important, because if you want to know what people really think, read the comments, profile your people, because if you over segment, right, and you come in and you're like, this is only who I want to focus on, the problem is you might miss a lot of people who might actually purchase the product. So these are algorithms that we're bidding on, right? Facebook and Google, and even on the programmatic exchanges, like they are smarter than you. And it's funny, you get this, we work with some very smart people, but like I like to think that these are algorithms that are built off of a lot of like AI, and they're using a lot of data that they have on people, that's even self-reported data to ultimately find the cheapest cost per conversion. So if you go and over segment your audiences because you think that you can do a better job, usually you can't, and you wind up pigeonholing yourself too much when you should be thinking, how do I go farther up funnel? How do I think of a more billboard and TV approach of like the 90s, right? Where it's like no tracking, no Facebook, like where it's traditional marketing, it's old school marketing. So how can I do that, but using these tools on the back end to extrapolate as much data as possible? That, which actually I'm going to tie into where the future is going, cookieless tracking, right? So this is going to be what's going to happen probably in the next 6 to 12 months, is what I'm being told from Facebook and from Google, moving away from the traditional pixel tracking. And even as we see right now with the iOS 14 update, once they roll that out, anyone who's doing app marketing as of right now it's going to change drastically. It's putting a lot of people in a somewhat of a tough spot.
Tell me more. I don't understand.
So iOS 14, when they updated, I believe in September, October, is now going to have opt-in. So anyone who has an iPhone who updates that, what you have to do now is opt in to have your data used for targeting. So when we work with app companies right now, I can optimize my ads around someone who may have seen the app or downloaded something or gotten or in-app purchases or anything that's in the app itself. What they're doing is they're kind of putting a wall on that. And when you download iOS 14, when they update all of the iPhones that are on the market, you will automatically be opted out. So it's kind of like Apple has made the decision to shut off the data stream that was coming between all of the apps, right? So right now, if you think about all the apps that are running in the background of your phone, things like Facebook, things like Waze, like they're just constantly pulling data on you. And that data is either being sold or it's being used to target you for other apps. That is going to be completely shut off. And you will have to opt in. And the fear is from a lot of people is who's going to opt into that, right? That's the big question.
And you said that links to what you call cookieless advertising, which brings us back to the old days of throw out the wide net. How does that how does that match up?
So iOS 14, that's one piece. But at the larger ecosystem, Google has said, I think they said by the end of not next year, but probably the year after, like they will have removed all of the cookie tracking, which they do, which has allowed Facebook to be the platform that it is. The reason that Facebook is so successful at what they do is because of the targeting that you can do on it, right? It's self-reported data when people input that into Facebook. But outside of that, the reason that, you know, when we work with companies and we're buying media and optimizing around certain events, right? Like when we launch a campaign, I can optimize around people who added to cart, who initiated checkout. I know which people have been on 5 pages. I know which people have been watched ads for over 30 seconds on my site. So all of that is tracked by the Facebook pixel and all of Google and the same. But what they are doing to move to a world where there's less tracking, Google basically said that they are going to remove the kind of cookies that they've been using to track people. And in turn, the way to get around it is to build what's called a server to server pixel integration, which we're working with brands right now to solve, because come some point this year, the pixel is pretty much going to be obsolete.
So what does that mean for our small and medium businesses that are looking to build their brand? How do they go forward?
Same way, and all of the server-side API information is available. So it's fine. It's not that it's going to allow. So if people ask, like, we run an agency, a fairly sizable one, like, how's that going to affect your business? The nice thing is that it's going to affect everybody's business. So agencies, I believe, are marketers who have always leaned on a content-first approach, which has always been like the traditional, more the first approach for advertising in general, will have an advantage because our approach is always leaning in from content angle rather than just trying to outbid the algorithm, right? There's a lot of platforms that I've seen people build, and then there's you know, people are building algorithms on top of algorithms. So if you look at Facebook, specifically this year was really trying to push everyone onto CBO, which is campaign budget optimization. So Facebook took a stance that said, we pretty much want you to only just upload content and we'll do the rest. We have all the data. So essentially, like, if in an ideal world, Facebook would remove all the media buyers and all the agencies that are buying and say, look, hey, X shop, just upload your content and let us do the rest. You know, Google's the same way. Google told us, they were like, when we were chatting with them, they were like, if we were to build Google again now, it would look much more like shopping. They would say, upload a product feed, upload some images and content, and let us do the rest, right? They have all of their smart products, which are AI driven anyway. And I think at some point there may be a push again. But this is the direction of these platforms, right? You look at things that they're launching as well, shoppable Instagram. You look at Mark Zuckerberg making a recent real push with Shopify. He's heads down pretty much trying to build, even removing like the website piece of it, right? Where like shoppable Instagram means like I see an ad, I click, and now I'm in the cart. Like there's a direct loop there. So again, focus on building content. And I think it's going to be an interesting couple of years, but e-commerce is definitely, you know, flash forward at about 5 years, given everything that I've seen go on, especially with COVID as of recent.
So I understand it. I mean, if you're saying basically, hey, Facebook and Google, I'll give you this much money to get me people who will buy it, and I trust that you'll figure it out. I mean, at the end of the day, it starts to look like whoever's got the most money wins, because there's only so many consumers in the world.
One way to put it, right? There's only so many consumers in the world, but that's where I can't emphasize enough that the days of products that are the value add, right? If someone comes to me, and I interview a lot of companies, right? And if they're like, the only value add for them is price, it's going to be tough to sell product. What companies that are succeeding now, look at all the D2C front runners that are out there. They are really good at building good product that solves needs, and they're able to build a one-to-one relationship with the consumer, right? Think of, like, I call it the reverse brick and mortar retail, like companies like Untuckit, right? So they build their big presence online, and then they go to the mall and they build a store, right? And even like, I'm here in LA in the Century City Mall, there's probably 7 companies that I personally know that all have storefront there. And when you ask them, I'm like, well, does it make money? They're like, look, as long as it's break even, it's just another place where I'm bringing awareness to the consumer. It's another touch point where I can go and interact. So going from online to brick and mortar, I think will be much more of a trend than the other way around.
And I think that's particularly interesting because it's exponential when we talk global. The idea of, hey, I can go D2C. At some point, you want to find partners in market that will engage with local consumers, that may have a pop-up, that may have some way to create sample engagement, even if you're not actually putting inventory in market.
Yeah, and I think the pop-ups are a great example. So we work with brands that will do it, I've worked with companies in New York and LA, because it's really good. People want to, if your only experience is online, it's tough, right? And people do a really good job of building the brand story and the product market fit. But if I can create a touch point, and then again, tying back to first party data. So I've been advertising my new e-commerce company for a while, and I would run something that says, hey guys, we'd love to come and meet you in person. Come to our pop-up here in LA for a week. Now I'm driving scarcity to actually create that one-to-one touch point with the consumer. I've seen it work time and time again. And people love it because you're actually driving a real experience to people rather than just an online promo.
It sparks an idea in my mind. A lot of companies say, well, I need my distributors in country because they're the ones who have the relationships with the brick and mortars, with the department stores, and they're going to get people walking through and touching my product. But if you actually say, look, I'm confident I can get the product to them at a right cost in the right delivery time, I need to find a partner that may or may not have their own brick and mortar. They just need to have the opportunities and the creativity to engage with consumers.
Correct. And I think that it brings up a good point and I get that. And I think it's that mentality of I need to have the touch point. It's the only way I'm going to drive business, but it's not. Let's say this year we have another bout, stores are closed. What's the mentality then? I think just because that's how it has been done, and I talk with enough large brands that that's all that they know, and they're afraid to pivot. And they're afraid to pivot because there's not enough companies and media buyers and agencies, if you will, that I think there's so much demand for it to drive quality new customers into the funnel that they get kind of lost in the noise, right? You have to really understand performance marketing to do a good job with this. And there's not a ton of companies in my opinion, that service the full accountability, the full funnel to do that. So a big brand's experience with a company that may tout themselves as a marketing agency that specializes in performance, but they're not. And now they've been burned by it and they're like, this doesn't work. And then they go back to what they knew and they were comfortable with. That's the problem that we're trying to solve as an agency, is how do we get in front of more people that may have been burned, because I have these conversations a lot as well, and show them that there is a path if your product is good and we can come up with content that works, even to take it cross-border.
Okay, big question for me. Every company I speak to has been burned in some way. It feels like it's snake oil. They say, look, I've talked to so many people, whether it's one guy fulanito in the garage, or it's an agency that they are giving me the 20-year-old who doesn't, the younger person, let's say, isn't even necessarily the equation. But they're talk about how do you identify and vet a marketing agency?
Yeah, good question. So I think there's a couple main things that are super important. One is understanding their philosophy, right? If they're not talking to you about content and how they tie that content to their media buying strategy, I'd say next. Don't even waste your time going any farther. The second thing I would look for is look at their portfolio of companies, right? What types of brands do they work with? If they are the type of agency that says, hey, we do everything, don't go any farther, right? Because I'd be like, my next question is, well, what do you do really well, right? Because we run an agency, we've built one, and we've grown. But unless you have a core competency, and that core competency is understanding media buying and creative and how to drive new people into the funnel, super important. So look at the portfolio of companies, understand their philosophy, right? If it sounds too good to be true, or it's using all sorts of things that you don't understand, probably not a good idea, right? Because we talk, and there's a lot of agencies in our competitive set, and I think that people are overcomplicate it so much that it actually is so simple, right? Content, media buying, and owning the entire funnel all the way through. That's it. I can talk with someone for probably about 5 minutes and dumb it down so much where it's it just makes sense. Now, may not be a fit for everybody, right? Let's say there's times where I'll pass on someone because I don't think it's a fit. But it's tough telling entrepreneurs no, right? Because I'm like, look, if you're saying, and this happens a lot, Greg, we're an apparel brand, We sell in brick and mortar retail. And I've worked with a lot of these wholesale partners, but now I want to cut them out. I want to cut the middleman out. And I'm like, well, what's the main differentiator? And they're like, well, we're going to be cheaper. I'm like, cheaper doesn't mean that it's going to be better. And it doesn't mean that I can create this one-to-one experience of why do people want to buy my brand? So I think understanding like why that product is different. So if someone doesn't roadmap how to take you from a 0 to like call it 3 months and 0 to 6 months, people ask me to roadmap a year. And sometimes I tell them, guys, I'm like, so much changes on these platforms that time and time again, let's focus on, I can show you where I think we would be in a year, but how do we get from 0 to 3 months and 3 to 6 months? The first 6 months are probably the most key and fundamental, because I need to build the content and most importantly, understand what that content is going to do, because we might have to go back to the drawing board and redo everything. So I think working with a brand that will dumb it down, that will offer you full transparency, meaning you own the ad account, you see everything that they're doing. There's never a black box. There's so many people who come in the door who work with agencies that don't provide transparency because they're afraid, right? The agencies I find that do that are afraid that companies will come in, they'll learn what they're doing, and they'll try and do it on their own. We are an open book, fully transparent, because at the end of the day, we want to bring value to our partners. If there comes a point where they're like, we're not getting value, that's okay with us, right? Like we want to work with good people. And I think what's most important is that work with someone that you get a good vibe from, that's done it before, offers transparency, and will scale their business around yours, meaning that they have their interests aligned. And most importantly, just look at their client roster, make sure that they've done it before.
I'm stuck on what you said around a client coming to you and say, hey, we want to cut out the distributor, we want to go D2C, and you say why, and the answer is because we're going to be cheaper. Obviously, that's not the differentiator, but if they say to you, well, because with more contact, if you can get it for the consumer, we can be agile and we're going to start adapting our product lines to fit those needs. That's an attractive interest for you?
That I like, because now what you're doing is you're taking a product that was in store that you didn't have a direct point of contact. And to your point, let's say you're like, you know what? We're going to listen to the consumer. We're going to poll them and we're going to do something different. We're going to do a once a month poll our current consumers and say, you know what? On the next run of product, we're going to listen to you, right? And we're actually going to create something new. So being adaptable and understanding the needs of the modern day consumer, if you are open to doing that and willing to take suggestions about how to do that, then that's a different conversation.
Shifting gears a little bit more tactical, do you need to create multiple social media accounts in different markets or for different segments, or one size fits all?
Ideally, you consolidate into a one size fits all, because what you will get into is, and we have companies that work in different countries and it's different accounts. So you'll get into some attribution issues. Sometimes you are stuck with the limitations of the platform that you're on. Meaning, I know that there's kind of plugins, so a lot of people use Shopify. But we routinely will work with companies that keep it separately. And it's for a variety of different reasons. I would say ideally it's all under one roof, but if it has to be under separate accounts because of limitation, then we understand that too.
But for example, if I'm talking about Facebook or Instagram, and I say, all right, Facebook and Instagram, if I want to be in Latin America, the Middle East, China, well, forget about China. Let's say on Instagram, if I want to be in Latin America, Middle East, in France, how do I deal with the language issues there? Or do I just keep one account and make sure my content is universal?
Yeah, so we work with translators on our side. And that's why, again, I think for the subset of companies we work with, they're product focused. So changing text on screen, changing ad copy that will kind of work a little bit there is not so hard. But that's where I just think it's important to, you want to understand what's working and being able to tie that. So if I find a winning ad in one area, I want to understand why that works and be able to kind of tie that into kind of some of the ad accounts as well. So when you break them up separately, it's a little bit more difficult to do so, and to also kind of tie those ads across channel.
So you would say you can actually post an ad in Arabic and Spanish and English on the same Instagram account?
Correct. I mean, essentially it's ad copy and it's the content itself, but yes, you can test in multiple languages. You're just swapping up the actual copy on the video itself.
We talk a little bit to companies who have multiple distributors, for example, around the world, other agencies in different markets, and creating kind of this war room centralized so that you can pull effective content from, let's say, Korea and put it over in Germany, depending on whether you think it's going to resonate. That's a little bit about what you're alluding to as well?
Correct. Exactly.
Okay, that's great. And that's something that every company could be doing today in terms of really getting their finger on the pulse of what's going on with your brand and centralizing it so that they can then shoot it out to another market and take advantage of that.
Exactly. Yep.
I want to talk to you, Greg, about last question. Almost last question. What's one of the campaigns that you're most proud of and surprised that it started to resonate in other markets outside the US?
So we work with a company called Bowbox. So I started working with Haral about 3 years ago, rolling into Q4 of 2018, 17. He had come off the most successful Kickstarter. He raised $9.5 million. It was the most successful apparel company Kickstarter at the time. But what he was struggling with was actually getting this product to sell via the website, rather Kickstarter. So we got in, we were able to kind of get him ramped up for Q4 of that year, had an astronomical year. And then as we rolled through into the following year, he wanted to really sell cross-border. He has really good logistics relationships, so he was able to facilitate the product coming out of China, going into the different countries. And then over the subsequent years, even this past Q4, we made a huge push on YouTube, and we're targeting multiple countries to the point we were chatting about earlier, getting traffic that was much cheaper in other countries. But we approached it from a content first, using YouTube to drive most of the new customer acquisition on the Google side. But we were pushing, a mid six-figure spend all the way through November, December, into the holidays, into multiple countries.
And why do you think it resonated? What was the content, the unique, why do you think that product resonated?
Yeah, so we shot a whole bunch of YouTube, like a whole 4-minute YouTube video, which people can check out on YouTube if they just probably put in Bowbox. It was a 3-day shoot focused on the new features of all it's a jacket that has 25 features. We rolled out a whole new piece. So we did a piece of long form content. It was about 4 minutes. And then we cut that down. We use that content elsewhere. But it's fun. It's catchy. We push super hard and aggressively on the prospecting front, betting on the fact that it would convert. And it actually, I think it's probably about, if I were to guess, 20 plus million views at this point.
Great. Greg, you mentioned a little bit about COVID. I think you've already covered a little bit about how COVID's changing things. Is there anything else you want to say about that? Otherwise, I'm going to move.
No, we can move. I mean, I think ultimately, as I mentioned, it's really shifted the way that people are going to do business. We are positioned to help companies that either were prepared or not prepared and ultimately need help pulling, and creating kind of these turnkey D2C solutions, or most importantly, just how to sell more product.
Okay. So things that a company can do, just to recap, companies that are small and medium that want to start testing, cast a wide net, let the data tell you where your market might be, and then double down on certain campaigns that you think could resonate, but localizing the existing content in the least kind of effort as possible. How would you put it together?
Yeah, I think the way is to approach, if I'm going to build content and I'm going to invest in a shoot, how do I make it enough so that I can change, if I want to later on, I want to invest on building content that focuses on the key value props of the product. And then later on, whether there was sound on or off, I could cut and build custom text overlay. So if you think about reverse engineering a video that has no sound, right? Because most video is previewed at least with sound off. So as long as I'm focusing in that video on the key value props of the product, I can later on cut whatever I want into the text, and even localize it then by market. Let's say in one market, we know that certain value props resonate better. Then we'll start with the text overlay that focuses on those value props in one market versus the other. So when I shoot hero content, focus on the product, and then later on know that I can localize it if I want within the actual ad copy itself.
Greg Gilman, Mute6, thanks for joining us. We're looking forward to seeing you out there in the new world order of digital. Thanks.
Thank you. Appreciate you having us.